Thanks. Well, I'll start and we have a little bit of a time constraint here because there are going to be 4 people in the panel that I'm helping moderate. But one of them, Scott Andes from EDA, needs to leave at 4:30. So I'm going to pivot almost immediately to a question to him. So this panel is turning the focus a little bit from the federal level to the state and local level. So the issue is not only how what the federal government does in place-based policy, but what state and local governments can do. However, and I will introduce all the panelists after I get my question to Scott. So just Ellen, Carlianne, and Josh, I apologize, but I need to try to get this question to Scott before he has to leave at 4:30. So Scott is at EDA. He's previously done a lot of tech work at other places, including directing a program at Carnegie Mellon, and it's been at National League of Cities, Brookings Institution. And at EDA, where he's been since September of 2021, he's directed the operation of the Build Back Better Regional Challenge Program, and now he's involved with the Recompete Act, both of which target many distressed areas. And I believe he has to leave at 4:30 actually to tell people about the Recompete Act. But just to briefly get the question to Scott, one of the things I'm going to mention when I more extensively frame this panel is one of the issues at the state and local level is state and local governments have recently been flushed with funds from all the federal dollars that went out. But that's ending. Or largely ending. It's not that there'll be no additional federal dollars, but not anywhere close to the magnitude that we saw. And of course, we'll see how things go with the Fed and with inflation and the economy, but we may be heading into a recession or at least some slowdown of economic growth, and that will create additional pressures on state and local governments. And Scott, in his work at EDA, is obviously EDA and Scott in his work is partnering with a lot of state and local governments and other organizations with their current federal programs. And I guess I'd like his brief comments before he has to go on what is EDA encouraging their state and local partners to pursue as some of their existing federal grants run out. What would you be hoping to see these state and local governments do and pivot as we may be moving into a time of more state and local budget austerity? What should they be doing in economic development with some of the federal dollars running out or being more limited than they have been more recently? What's your thoughts on that, Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I apologize that I have to leave early for us. Tim said a public thing on the Recompetes program. But so to answer the question, I think the first thing I would say that we hope state and local governments will do is follow research from folks like you and recognize where the ROI is really the highest in economic development. And I think you hit the nail on the head talking about just the costs of some of these incentive packages for large businesses and whatnot. They just, in my view, ROI on programs like we're kicking off in the federal government that are highly tailored to local conditions. They're very competitive, they're merit-based, and they're based on research, and they're based on what we know works in the world of economic development. State and local dollars will just simply go further if they pursue these types of activities versus the type of run-of-mill kind of tire kick in economic development that's all about tax incentives and trying to bring in companies that many of which may have well come to a community anyway. So that'd be the first thing that I would say is we really hope that we can begin to encourage and motivate and create a sort of a race to the top, so to speak, amongst state and local governments through these competitions to focus on those things that we know work a lot better. And I think we're seeing some of this. By my count, there are 4 or 5 states that currently have kicked off similar cluster-based economic development competitions that look like the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. So Indiana's got one at about $500 million. California's got one at $500 million. There's a number of other states that are considering these. And I think the reason why they're doing so is they simply get more out of it than a lot of the traditional activities. But funding is only one thing, right? I think there's like a lot of other things state and local governments can do, and we're trying to motivate that through these competitions. So for example, in our 2 new competitions, the Tech Hubs program and the recompetes pilot program, one thing we're trying to experiment with is what we're calling incentivizing community and policy commitments. So what could the local Department of Health and Human Services do to partner with a training program that we may fund? What could a local business do around eliminating certain degree requirements? So I think there's a lot of policy interventions that state and local governments can pursue to really push their economic development dollars further. So that's sort of one thing. And then I think the other thing that we found that's a lot of state and local governments have been taking advantage of is they've been using the federal diligence process to de-risk some of their investments. So while we had $1 billion through our last program, we had $4.4 billion in requests among our 60 finalists. In probably a half dozen states, we actually talked to the governor's office after we ran our process and helped them think about how they would use their dollars to backfill things that we couldn't fund with our limited, relatively speaking, limited funds. So I think there's partnership models where we can bring to the table different evaluation and technical assistance components, or even just the process by which you running a large competition, you get lots and lots of places that have strategic plans and investment priorities that tend to be much stronger and much more cohesive than your sort of traditional tax credit type thing. So I think that's a number of things that we really think states can do that have been effective. I think the other just realpolitik of some of the declining budget realities is states and localities they don't like what they call the mortgage problem. They don't like funding things that they have to keep funding over and over again. And I'm concerned about this, right? Because like a lot of workforce development programs, a lot of business support programs, the MEPs, they do need to happen over and over and over again. A building doesn't just solve all your problems. So thinking through how we can help states when they realize they've got lots of ARP dollars now, but they're not going to in the future. So how do they find those one cost or those sort of fixed cost investments that they can make now, but also have like a really high ROI? I think that's something that a lot of them are asking, and I think it's an incredibly timely policy consideration and something that folks could really be supportive of. But let me pause there, Tim.
Well, thank you, Scott, and I appreciate you making the time to do this. And you've actually brought up a number of key issues here. But let me now move back and introduce the whole panel. I know, Scott, you'll have to leave in a few minutes, but as I said, this is basically about what state and local governments can do, because state and local governments play a major role here. And in fact, a lot of place-based money is what state and local governments do. So we have a number of people who have different involvement with this. Josh Goodman is a senior officer with Pew Charitable Trust State Fiscal Policy Team, and he's served as the lead on many reports that have looked at evaluating tax incentives and geographically targeting place-based economic development programs. Ellen Harpel is the founder of Smart Incentives, and which works with state and local governments to design and implement better incentive programs that are more effective, more responsible, and also is very interested in helping places improve transparency and accountability in what they do with incentives. And Carlianne Patrick is Associate Professor of Economics at Georgia State University, and her research looks at local variation in incentives and how that affects firms and other economic agents, and looks at place-based policies. Now, as I already mentioned, the framing of this is that we can talk a lot about federal place-based policies, but clearly a lot of the major dollars in this are in what the state and local governments do. And the major thing that state and local governments do, as Scott already referred to, are business tax incentives. And in recent years, this has just ballooned. I mean, I estimated some years back that we were devoting $50 billion a year to incentives. And when we see what is going on with bids for electric vehicles by Michigan, Tennessee, and Kentucky, it's clearly gone well beyond that. It seems unlikely that that will be able to continue at that scale. I mean, even though the federal dollars cannot directly be used to fund these incentive packages, money is fungible, and it finds ways to help state and local governments do this. So, one of the things the question that Scott already addressed is what should state and local governments be doing with their incentive packages? And Scott already suggested that maybe they should emulate some of what the federal government's trying to encourage and emphasize programs that may work better than handing out money and business tax incentives. And as I already said, the other issue that we need to deal with are these budget constraints for state and local governments. And what are the programs with a high ROI, as Scott referred to, that state and local governments can continue even if the economy slows down, we have a recession, we run out of federal money. And finally, one issue I hope we can address, we've already kind of discussed the fact that there are two types of place-based policies, ones that are rationalized by trying to promote tech hubs and try to exploit agglomeration economies and doing high ROI activities. And the other is exploiting the high ROI you can get if you invest in distressed places and actually get people out of unemployment or underemployment into good jobs. Because there's a tremendous return to that. It's not just an equity return, it's an efficiency return if you can get more people into good jobs. So, and I really want to know, one of the issue is, can states actually succeed in doing more targeting in distressed places? Because traditionally states have not really done this very much. I mean, there's a tendency for states to do an enterprise zone program, and then pretty soon the whole state's an enterprise zone. That's the reality of how things work. And one question is what can we do to help states improve their own practice? And also, is there anything the federal government could do maybe to encourage more state targeting? Scott already referred to the fact that EDA is trying to encourage governors in California and New York and other states that certainly have progressive goals to do more of this and to maybe fund some things that the federal government couldn't afford to fund. So first turning, I'm going to ask questions of each of the three other panelists, and then I'll ask a more general question. So turning first to Josh Goodman at Pew, from your work at Pew with state governments and both their fiscal situation, economic development budgets, how have states changed their economic development policies in recent years? And where do you think they'll be going over the next 3 to 5 years? What are some of the developments that people should be aware of?
Well, thanks a lot, Tim, and thank you everyone so much for being with us today. And I think, framing this around sort of reduced state resources is interesting because I think you can tell a story actually going back to the last time states didn't have much in the way of resources. And so if you look all the way back at the Great Recession, you might think that like when states' budgets are constrained, then they're really selective about what kind of economic development programs they pursue. And in some cases, I'm sure that, some instances, I'm sure that's the case. But what we also saw going all the way back to the Great Recession is states get desperate. If their economies aren't doing well, that's where you have just what you described, Tim, of, you had these really targeted place-based programs. Suddenly they're available in the entire state. You had, high standards for the quality of jobs. Suddenly you're diluting those standards. Maybe you had particular industries you're targeting. You're opening that way up. And you're making these commitments because you don't have a lot of money right now that might last for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, which is regularly a problem with incentives. And so states are very good at, if their financial resources are constrained, still finding a way to offer incentives. Now, what we saw really coming out of the Great Recession is there were a lot of incentive programs that states recognized weren't working very well. And there were, because of some of those decisions they made. And so there was really this movement to evaluate economic development programs in general and tax incentives in particular. And it's really been a success story for states where, when we at Pew started research on this, there were just a handful of states regularly evaluating incentives. Few states were doing it rigorously, few states were doing it systematically. And today we have 30 states that evaluate their incentives. Those processes generally task some kind of professional staff, so economists, auditors, other kinds of staff within state government to study these programs. And what's really happened over the last few years is this evidence base has been growing and growing, and you have states that now they can turn to each other to understand these programs. And so, if they're evaluating a particular type of incentive program, there are maybe 10 or 12 or 15 other states that have evaluated that program. And so there's this growing evidence base. So I think for people in this audience, it's important to know about that evidence base and as if you're thinking about federal policy, if you're thinking about local policy, to turn to those evaluations. And I should say that Tim and Ellen as well have been big partners in kind of making that happen. And there have been a lot of evaluations also outside of state government that have helped along the way. And so there's the database at the it's through the National Conference of State Legislatures if you're looking for those evaluations. Part of what they've looked at is, of course, place-based programs. And so all the kinds of questions that speakers have been talking about today in terms of, okay, are we targeting the right areas? Are we updating the list of eligible locations? Are the people who live in those locations actually benefiting? Is the design of these programs, does it really even make sense in a fundamental way? All those things are things that states are starting to ask in their evaluations. I think some of those questions have been sort of second ones where, it isn't the first thing they've looked at, but as they look at these programs more and more, they've been asking them. So I think just to finish on your question about what comes next, I think there's a lot of questions about, as Scott alluded to, like, is there a new model of economic development? Is it, states are trying to do new things. They care more about attracting people than companies than they ever have before. I think they care more about, who benefits from incentives than they ever have before. At the same time, if as you said, if a car manufacturing company is potentially coming to their state, that's a really big deal. And there's going to be a big incentive package around that. So, whether there's a new model that's sort of complementary to the old one, or really there's a fundamental change that's going on, is something I'm going to be looking at.
Thanks, Josh. And I'm glad you recognize the political reality, which I, for example, think that Michigan Governor Whitmer would be crazy if she didn't try to authorize some incentives for electric vehicles. I mean, or so let's put it this way, politically, she would certainly be crazy, get in big political trouble. Ellen, I want to turn to you now to see what you can, so you can add some things to what what's already been said about some of the trends. About there's been some, as Josh mentioned, there has been an important trend towards evaluation. But what are some of the trends? You work a lot of times with a lot of state and local governments on incentives. What trends do you see going on right now? And do you have your crystal ball out to make a forecast for how things are going to go over the next 3 to 5 years? Are you optimistic that we'll see an improved incentive package, or Josh suggested that maybe if the economy goes bad, we'll see kind of reversion to bad past trends? Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I'm always optimistic that the more we think about this and the more people are spending time on it, the better the policies become. But there's always a chance that something kind of new and crazy comes along and that you can't predict. But I am optimistic. But I want to start by saying I think it's a misperception, and I want to start out, by addressing this, to say that state and local economic development policy is primarily about incentives. If you look at the day-to-day work of most state and local economic development organizations, incentives and even business attraction is just one part of what they do. So they are already, and they have already been working on workforce development issues, infrastructure development, community planning. This is part of what they do all the time. And incentives are part of what they do. And it's just one small part of it. It's the highest profile thing that they do, and it by far gets the most attention, but it's important to remember that they do all of these other things as well. And even within the incentives realm, there's a very wide range. It's not all tax incentives. It's a variety of different kinds of programs that are offered to help people, businesses, and places in their states or their communities. So I think that's a very important thing to remember as we talk about what are the trends of some of the mega projects. So I do want to spend a minute talking about that and about where these very large incentive packages are going to go. I think while there are mega projects like the EV, electric vehicle, and the battery projects, there are going to be super incentive packages that go along with them. But I don't think that those are going to be sustained over time. I think it's a particular point of time right now where we're going to have a lot of these mega projects. When those stop happening, you're not going to see as many mega incentive, packages that go along with them because they're correlated. I think the bigger concern is not so much the size of the incentive package, but the composition of the incentive package. And this is where the evaluations and some of the improvements in how incentives are designed and offered you can really see the differences, where almost all of them are performance-based. Almost all of them have big components, which are sometimes the higher dollar values, which are really investing in yourself, as I like to say. So they are investments that go to the company, but also to the community, like investments in workforce, and infrastructure, water, roads, all of these kinds of things are, they're part of the incentive offer. So when you see that top line headline number about a very large incentive package, it often includes those other components as well. And that comes out of the work that we've all been talking about, including the evaluations, just to kind of show the value of those kinds of activities. But I do think the thing that is not taken into account nearly enough is what happens to some of these projects when they don't pan out as planned, because the time frame for the ROI calculation is probably decades. Well, we know for sure that whatever you're planning today is not the way something is going to look probably 10 and certainly not 30 years from now. Too many things that are unpredictable are out there that are going to change in the economy and in the technology. So I think that's something I would like to see for more effective and responsible incentive use, is more accounting for the risk factor of things not happening out in the straight line that, you know, these ROI calculations are based on. But I do think that there will be a pulling back just because of the nature of the projects in the super large incentive packages. But the other trend that I think is really valuable that we will continue to see is kind of what I was just saying, these invest in yourself first parts of the incentive packages. We see this already in state and local offers that are made, and we see it kind of built into the CHIPS incentives, where those community benefits and those ways of understanding how the investment in the cluster or in the company is expected to generate these benefits for the community. And so finding ways to evaluate and assess that so those can be built into the ROI calculations, I think that's really an important step that we all need to take. It's been an issue that's out there for a while and kind of connected to the evaluation theme that was raised in the first panel. Tim, you mentioned investments in people as well, and I think that will be a very interesting place to see where incentive policies go. It's compelling, investing in your own people through, you know, whether it's workforce development or other, like in Virginia with the attracting Amazon HQ2, they had a big part of their incentive package was investment in the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus in Alexandria. So it wasn't an incentive to Amazon, but it was an important reason why Amazon came. So like those kinds of investments, I think we'll see more and more of those. So those are kind of people-based. Some of the remote workers and trying to attract different types of people to the state, I think those are going to be a tough sell over the long term, because everyone's trying to attract people who are pretty much already well off and well educated and have a lot of economic options anyway. So I think those will come and go, and some of them will stay. But I don't think they'll ever be a huge part of what the incentives on offer are about. But I do think that continued investments in people and places will be a big part of the incentive, you know, portfolio going forward.
Well, and thanks. And I appreciate you emphasizing for this group that state and local policy is a lot more than the business tax incentives. I do think a lot of the major dollars go into that, but in some ways, the biggest effects are some of the other programs working on permitting, the environmental permits, working on getting the infrastructure in place, the zoning in place, making sure the community college is ready to help train. All of that's extremely important, and that's going on around the country. And maybe, as Scott said before he had to leave, you can argue that has a lot higher ROI, and maybe hopefully, you know, we have these evaluations that help back that up. Okay, I want to turn it to Carlianne, and I guess my question for you is then, you know, broadening it. Well, we've already broadened it out beyond incentives, so in some sense the question's the same as for Ellen. What trends do you see from your perspective going on with state and local economic development policies? And I guess I'd like to know the particular focus is, it was asked earlier of Congressman Clyburn, do these policies really pay off for residents? You know, yeah, we generate economic growth and job growth, but who actually benefits? And one of the issues that if you could address is, what could state and local governments be doing now to increase the labor market benefits of these policies for local residents?
Well, thank you. And I guess one of the advantages and disadvantages of going last in the panel is the place that I was going to start has already been mentioned by a couple folks, and that is this continuing trend in the number and size of very large incentive packages for a single large establishment. And this trend's been going on for a number of years. It predated the EV wave that we're seeing now. So even though we might not see quite what we're seeing with semiconductors and EV long term, this has been an ongoing trend for a while now. And as has been noted, these packages are comprised of a combination of state and local government incentives, and the state portions will include things like tax credits, grants, infrastructure, special deal closing allocations, and a significant portion of the local incentive will actually come from property tax abatements. And that's particularly important because property taxes are the primary source of own revenue for most local governments, particularly as a K through 12 funding mechanism. And this trend is concerning because the existing empirical research, and this includes not just work of mine, but also by Caitlin Slattery, Owen Zadar, you, Tim, others, suggest that this strategy does not create lasting economic development for local residents. In part, this is due to new jobs being filled by in-migrants, but even if we look beyond the direct jobs, the evidence does not indicate significant aggregate changes in employment, establishments, or output in these locations. So this suggests that there are these general equilibrium effects that dominate the gains that we get at the one incentive establishment. And while incenting these projects is theoretically welfare enhancing, by getting establishments to choose locations that benefit from the project more than others would, the data actually indicate that those gains, those welfare gains, are all reaped by the establishment and firm and not by the location. So why, despite the academic research, does this strategy continue? And we've already alluded to it. It's largely because these projects are high profile and salient in ways that tend to reap political benefits. And it also tends to play into this social narrative that distrusts academic research and evaluations. So related to that, while we're seeing a trend towards states requiring more systematic evaluation of statutory economic development incentive programs, we also continue to see that statutory net taxes, so that statutory net tax is being defined as statutory taxes minus statutory economic development incentives like sales tax exemptions, tax credits, etc., that those statutory net taxes for export industries continue to decline. This is not true on average for non-export industries. So the trend is also this increasing gap between net taxes for export and non-export industries, despite the fact that like several non-export sectors are experiencing growth like healthcare and you know, those sorts of things. So we're continuing to see that wedge and that those net taxes are declining for the export industries. And again, existing academic research indicates that location decisions and aggregate area outcomes are not particularly sensitive to these statutory tax rates or the incentives. And that there's not a whole lot of existing evidence that suggests that the existing local residents in targeted places benefit from these programs. And this is due to a couple of things. One is that taxes overall are a small portion of the establishment's budget, and therefore they may make marginal location decisions based on it, but they're not making sweeping changes. But another reason we've already alluded to is poor targeting, with relatively better off places benefiting from the programs. But then there's this new line of research that suggests there's all of these other general equilibrium effects through things like capital labor substitution, whereby the incentive actually induces fewer jobs and more investment in high technology capital. Through competition for land or crowding out of startups who have to compete for the same resources, but face a higher tax rate. So there is also evidence that these incentives are more generous for industries with lower shares of female and minority workers, as well as industries with higher male wage premiums. So again, this may be why we don't see quite as much inclusivity for local residents when we think about those who are already sort of marginalized and the industries that are targeted being moved away from that. However, as has been alluded to as well, the increase in evaluations has actually pointed to some ways of improving the targeting and outcomes for local residents. And there are some notable evolutions of programs that incorporate this research into new programs and policy changes. However, on average, states are slow or politically resistant to make those changes to existing incentive policies. And we've seen this during the most recent budget cycle, in which state and local governments began to make the budgetary trade-offs that are going to be necessitated by scaling back of these federal transfers. If you look across the country, most of the statutory economic development incentive programs remain largely untouched. The budget constraints were met through cuts in other areas that have long-term economic development consequences, as well as cuts in short-term support for displaced and marginalized workers. So for example, my own state is one of several that reduced budgetary allocations for public higher education systems. Others have reduced support for childcare and food security programs that support displaced workers as they attempt to reskill. And these are the exact type of programs that could increase opportunities for upward mobility and perhaps address some of the issues that underlie the sort of polarizing narratives that hamper changes to state and local economic development strategies. We've also seen states with temporary budget surpluses have tended to either issue tax refunds or create tax cuts or do both. And those decisions are going to continue into the future and require additional trade-offs in the future. So in my view, maximizing the effect of economic development incentives for locals is going to require more than just improving existing incentive programs and policies. That's certainly part of it, but it's going to require balancing the trade-offs between these large subsidy package strategies, these industry targeted strategies through statutory taxes and incentives, and then the trade-off with the systems that are required for sort of nimbly upscaling workers, which is more than just a workforce training program. And I think beyond what we oftentimes think of as economic development.
Thanks, Carlianne. We're running a little bit out of time in the sense that things ran over a little bit, and we do need to end this at least close to 5. This panel, we have maybe 10, 12 more minutes. So I'm going to take, I had 2 general questions I'm going to combine into one. So we've had a mixture of optimism and pessimism here. I won't identify who the optimists and pessimists are. We can figure that out. But we clearly have had some positive trends, but there's some negative trends. But here I want to kind of end on a little bit of what I would call an optimistic note, which is, among state and local governments that you are familiar with, that you've worked with or observed, what do you think some of the most innovative, what are some models out there that you indicate some of the most innovative program developments going on in state and local economic development? And if there are any of those that include targeting distressed places, I'd be interested in hearing about that as well. So the question is, what are some of those innovative models out there in state and local economic development? And do any of those include targeting places and folks in distress? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can, since I just finished it, because it follows directly from what I said. One of the models that I'm pretty excited about seeing in Austin is one place where they've implemented it is they have a group called Workforce Solutions. It works with their economic development recruitment team. But more importantly, it is a one-stop shop for not just workforce training and reskilling for the jobs that are being recruited, but it is a one-stop shop for wraparound services. So there are childcare, transportation, many of the barriers that marginalized people face with regards to upskilling to face the new challenges in the economy that they're experiencing, they can go to their workforce solution for training, but also receive the things that allow them to do the training, whether it be SNAP or a car option or something else. And I think sort of an integrated approach across your recruiters, your workforce development, and your wraparound services is a really neat innovation.
I think that's great, Carlianne. And I just want to mention there's a similar kind of program that actually my employer, the Upjohn Institute, in addition to running the research stuff that I'm in, has an operations division that runs job training programs. And one thing they've done with funding from the Kellogg Foundation is run neighborhood employment hubs in high poverty neighborhoods in Battle Creek, Michigan, located in local churches, local community groups, local subsidized housing project, and they essentially provide, they bring the services into the neighborhood and try to provide various wraparound services, including job success coaches, help in finding childcare. They'll help people get a used car that's reliable, that kind of thing. Any event, and there's a write-up by that. You can find the Upjohn website by Katie Boulder, who's the project director of our place-based initiative at the Upjohn Institute. Anyway, Josh, Ellen, comments on innovative models you'd like to point out to people.
Sure, I can jump in with one, and I want to focus on, as you mentioned, something related to place-based programs. So we see in these evaluations I was describing, assessments of, are the right places benefiting, how are these programs targeted, and one thing that becomes really clear is like targeting is really hard, and I think the Opportunity Zone's presentation really framed some of those issues well. That it seems pretty obvious. Like, I know what neighborhood in my city is distressed. I know what city in my metropolitan area is distressed. And yet you run into these issues of, well, what if it all goes to the least distressed eligible areas, all the benefits? Or what if these areas were already improving prior to the programs being made? Or there's sort of countless, economic indicators you can use to target these programs. So one really nice example of tackling at least some of those issues was out of New Jersey. In New Jersey, they have something called the Municipal Revitalization Index, which is a ranking of every municipality in New Jersey, towns, townships, et cetera, from most distressed to least distressed. And what they did was they really carefully scrutinized the indicators that they were using for that index. And they found things like, well, we have the standard for municipalities with more old homes count as more distressed, and yet we have these World War II era bedroom communities that were built next to shipyards that are that we're calling really distressed, but they're not actually distressed. They're just old, and there's nothing really inherently distressed about old buildings. And so by looking at that criteria and then going around the country looking at all these indices that different states use, they were able to identify criteria that really sort of did a better job measuring fundamental distress and updated the Municipal Revitalization Index based on that. So that's a small example. There are big targeting questions of, what are we even trying to do with targeting? Do local residents benefit? But I like that example because it shows that, if you think seriously about this stuff and you gather data on it and you take some time to look at it, you can make progress.
Josh, where can you find a write-up? Is there a good write-up of the New Jersey?
Sure, yeah. It's available on New Jersey's website. It's also in a report we published a couple years ago.
Pew,
from Pew. It was how states can direct economic development to people and places in need. So if you look up that report, we talk about it at some length in there.
Okay, great, Josh. Ellen, your models of good practice.
Yeah, I've got a couple. One I'll just mention briefly, and about being innovative. And I think post-pandemic, a lot of state and local governments became a lot more creative and took a look at their very old and very stale small business support programs, which basically had stopped working or doing much for the community, and they just kind of kept going on. And the pandemic caused everyone, I think, to rethink how they offer small business support services. So there's a lot of innovation and much better programming out there now than there was before. But the one that I want to mention about distressed communities is it's called Recovery to Work. And I learned about it through a case study I did in Upper Cumberland, Tennessee, so Middle Tennessee, primarily counties that have been designated distressed. But to Josh's point about the challenges of targeting, this program as far back as I've gone, really came up from the community. So it wasn't a situation where somebody said, hey, you're distressed by these metrics that I've created, and now we're going to have a program to help you with some part of that. They are a distressed community, and they had a problem, which is substance abuse, and then which became much, much worse in the opioid epidemic. And then they created solutions to address that, which then caught the attention of others in the state and federal level. And now there are federal programs to support. In this case, it's called Recovery to Work. So the idea is that as people are recovering from substance use disorders, and they are trying to get back into employment, they need also a lot of support services. This is a very difficult path for them, for anyone in recovery. And there are many issues, some of which Carlianne mentioned in her example, which also apply in this situation too. A need not just to get through the recovery successfully, which is really hard, but because you've probably lost your job and lost your family, or your family connections may be different than they were before, or you've been in the you've been incarcerated or in the justice system. You have all these challenges. You probably don't have a stable housing. You might not have a car. You have a hard time kind of getting back to stable employment. At the same time, and this makes the economic development connection, employers really need everyone that they can get, and they want more workers in the community, and to work for their establishments. So it's in everyone's interest to find a way to have people in this Recovery to Work program so that they're in stable employment, also benefits for families and communities and schools down the road. So I think this is really innovative because it does come from the ground up. And I think that's a good way to think about it, as many economic development programs as can come from the community themselves, so it's useful to them, as opposed to a top-down model, I think is valuable. But I also think that the holistic element, which Representative Clyburn mentioned, which many of the panelists have mentioned, is really critical here, because it's not just one program, it's not just doing one thing. As an economic development consultant, I remember interviewing people and asking about, well, what about workforce credentialing and workforce development? And they're like, people are credentialed, they're educated, they used to have good jobs, and now they don't. So it's tempting to want to reach for that one program, say, oh, if we just get this credentialing program or this training program in place, we'll solve the problem. And it's never going to be like that for distressed communities. It always has to bring a lot of different resources to the table. And that's why it's, I think it was Benga who mentioned kind of having these liaisons where you can find ways to help capacity constrained communities access what is already out there and bring them together in a way that helps them. To me, that's innovative. And to me, that's really beneficial for distressed communities.
Thanks. That's great. I think that one of the things that you guys have really done a good job helping bring to this discussion is, I can remember back when I first started getting involved with this stuff back in the 1970s, you'd see these things published, coordinating economic development, workforce development, and community development. People have been talking about this forever. I think people recognize you need holistic solutions. I think people recognize the problems of different places differ enormously. What Upper Cumberland needs is not the same as what Austin needs, may not be the same as what New Jersey needs, is not the same as what Battle Creek, Michigan needs. And that's part of why we need to think through, how do we actually empower communities? As Benga mentioned, how do we give them the capacity, help give them, on the one hand, recognize they may not have the capacity to address these problems fully, right? I mean, they may need planning help or whatever. On the other hand, thinking that the federal government has magic solutions and that if we just did categorical program X and categorical program Y, we're going to solve everyone's problems is a little delusional, frankly. So there's as usual, there's a mixture of different ideas here that you guys have done a great job of pulling together. Is there anything else people wanted to mention that before we close? Okay, well, we're right at 4:58. So I now need to turn things over to Hillary Hoynes, who's director of the Opportunity Lab, and Hillary will make some closing remarks at this event. Thank you to everyone on the panel and everyone this whole day for participating. I really think there were some great ideas that got surfaced, and hopefully people have some reading to do.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you to all the panelists for just a fantastic day, as well as our two kickoff speakers. So I want to also make sure that we thank the team at the Upjohn Institute and also more generally all the panelist organizations for helping us get the word out on this really fantastic event. Promoting a Zoom event in the middle of summer is a bit of a challenge, and we appreciate all the help to get the word out. So thanks again. We also thank Mark Steinmeier and the Smith Richardson Foundation for sponsoring the event and all of this incredible work that the OLAB is doing on place-based policy. And I just want to leave you all with one final word before we wrap up the event today, and that is keep in touch. Many of you may not have been familiar with the Opportunity Lab prior to today's talks, and we're so happy you were able to join us. And we encourage you to reach out about opportunities for partnership. As Danny said at the beginning of today's sessions, we have a network of faculty and graduate students at UC Berkeley who are focused on research promoting social and economic mobility with a deep interest in policy and engagement. So if you have any questions or are interested in ways we might be able to connect or collaborate, please be in touch. And just a final reminder that today's event has been recorded, and so we will be sharing the video or parts thereof in the coming week or two. And we would be happy for you to share it with anyone in your network who was not able to attend today. So thank you again. And with this, we will close out the webinar, and we hope to see you all soon with more exciting work on place-based policy. Thank you so much.